broadcast completes 2 years of doing monthly webinars, and sometimes a little more often, from our platform here in Oakview. And many of you have been on many of those, and we're really grateful for your faithful attendance. Thanks for joining us tonight. It's cold here in Oakview, probably not as cold as Toronto or Winnipeg or some of the other places folk are beaming in from, but we're really glad that you're here. Want to say hello?
Yeah, I do. Thanks all for joining us for this wonderful season of Advent, and I'm glad you're all with us to think about an Advent theme this evening together. So thanks.
And yes, all of us here, that's Elaine and I here in the studio room, and Tim and Charlita at the console in the other room. We're all drinking a little eggnog with a little bit of rum. Here's Tim. Let's clink.
Where's Charlita? Oh no, Charlita's got the big bottle.
Here's the team. All right. So we encourage you to do the same. We are going to get right to it. Today, December 10th, is International Human Rights Day. It's the day that we are supposed to remember the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is a very good reason to focus on tonight's theme, which is the struggle for life and dignity, past, present, and future. So let's just take a moment, whether it's 5:50 p.m. or 8:50 p.m. where you are in your time zone, let's just take a moment to remember all who struggle today to secure basic human rights, both in the neighborhood and across the globe. So let's just take a brief moment of silent prayer. Amen. And Brother Steve Clemens, who's hunkered down in 10-degree weather there in Minneapolis, reminds us it's also Kathy Kelly's birthday. And of course, Kathy is one of the great champions of human rights in our day. I also think, when I think of human rights, I think of this man, Roberto Martinez, a champion of immigrant rights at the U.S.-Mexico border, a mentor of mine, colleague with the American Friends Service Committee for many years. Roberto is featured in our God is Undocumented book, as many of you know. The book was dedicated to him, and that's because he was such a veteran of the struggle for human rights, particularly of the most vulnerable, the undocumented. And 20 years ago, Roberto began this amazing experiment in public liturgy called the Posadas sin Fronteras. That was his brainchild, in which he imagined that the traditional Mexican-American liturgy of Posadas could be relocated right to the border fence. And the traditional litany could be sung back and forth across that fence on both sides of the border. This Saturday will be the 20th anniversary of the Posada at the border. And many of us will be going down to join that. Our very first webinar 2 years ago, which a few of you were on, focused on this prophetic tradition. Whereas last year, our webinar looked at Luke's nativity story, upon which the Posada is based. And we interviewed Del McCormick, another veteran immigrant rights organizer, formerly of Border Links, and also profiled in Our God is Undocumented. You can order an archived version of that program on our site. Now tonight, the Posada sin Fronteras will not be our focus. But as I said, a number of us are going to be going down to this 20th anniversary Posada. And so we especially want to welcome onto the webinar tonight folks who have registered for this year's Advent Women's Retreat. Do you want to say a word about that?
Yeah, we are going to gather on Friday night, about an hour and a half north of the border. And I think there are 15 of us that are coming together. And on Saturday, we'll study the gospel, the Christmas story in Luke on Saturday morning. And then that afternoon, we'll caravan down to the border to participate with the rest of the larger community in this Posadas, and then come back for reflection and good food afterwards. So very grateful to the women that have signed up, and I look forward to our time together.
And as Charlita said in her comment, this is co-sponsored by BCM and the Abundant Table Farm Project. So we wish more of you could join us, but we're looking forward. I know to that you all are looking forward to that retreat. I will join them at the Posada. So to help those of us who are going to be at the border in a few days and all of the rest of us as we journey through the Advent season, tonight's webinar seeks to connect some dots between cultural and biblical traditions. We're going to begin with another revered Mexican-American tradition, and that is the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe. It falls each year roughly midway through the season of Advent on December 12th, which is this coming Thursday. We're going to do a little study of that story and its symbolism, and then we're going to look at how that tradition is grounded in several biblical traditions. First and foremost, Guadalupe invokes the image of the woman clothed with the sun, who appears halfway through John's book of Revelation. We'll then see how that story in turn remembers still older biblical narratives, such as the birth of Moses in Exodus and the birth of Jesus in Matthew. So let's begin by looking at the roots of these traditions of strong prophetic women in the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew word for wisdom, chokhmah, and its equivalent in Greek, Sophia, are both feminine. Now, the book of Proverbs asserts that wisdom is personified in Sophia, chokhmah, whose truth pre-exists creation. Indeed, who co-created the world with God. I was beside God, says Lady Wisdom, like a master worker, daily God's delight, and rejoicing always in the inhabited world and delighting in the human race. That's beautiful creation spirituality there. This tradition, of course, was appropriated into the person of Jesus as Sophia embodied. Still a feminine idea, so Luke's Jesus in chapter 7 says wisdom is recognized only by her children. Sophia tradition is particularly revered in the Eastern Church, but not so much in our Western ecclesial traditions. So we're delighted to reintroduce this very, very important theological tradition.
The most famous articulation of the Sophia image in the Hebrew Bible is found in Proverbs 8 and 9, which portrays wisdom as a female prophet trying to get the attention of the people of her village. Sophia urgently takes her stand, crying out, on the heights beside the way, at the crossroads, in front of the gates, at the entrance of the portals. A woman would not typically have been seen in such prominent public places in the patriarchal culture of antiquity, where they were largely sequestered at home. But Lady Wisdom's message of justice breaks gender taboos in its insistence and persistence. Then in Proverbs 9, Sophia is pictured setting a table for a feast to which those without understanding are invited. Both images of Sophia are profoundly maternal. The wise old crone demanding a hearing, and the householder offering warm, nurturing hospitality. This powerful interventionary role of women is occasionally told in other parts of Scripture. For example, in 1 Samuel 25, we find the extraordinary story of Abigail, who confronted the warrior David's mission of vengeance on her husband by meeting David's army in a field, armed only with a sumptuous banquet. Impressed with her courage and creativity, David abandoned his plans for retribution. This ancient story reminds us that women have long held up the world, not only in their nurturing strength, but also by making peace in the home, the neighborhood, and beyond, fiercely protecting their children. This tradition extends well beyond the Bible. For example, in ancient Greece, Aristophanes' famous comedy, Lysistrata, describes how the bloody 20-year Peloponnesian War was finally halted only when the women of Athens refused to have sex with their husbands.
What?
Hostilities ceased in 6 days. Lysistrata, loosely translated, means she who disbands armies. This comedy is one of the few surviving plays written by Aristophanes and was originally performed in Athens in 411 BCE. In most indigenous cultures, women have played special roles as peacemakers, intervening in conflicts and often declaring truces in war. For example, the entire Lenape clan of the Delaware Valley in Pennsylvania was appointed by the Iroquois Confederacy to play the role as mediators and peacemakers in tribal conflicts, and were collectively referred to as women. The Lenape sacred story, the Walla Ulam, goes this way. It is not well that all nations should war, for that will finally bring about the destruction of the Indians. So we have thought of a means to prevent this before it is too late. Let one nation be the woman. We will place her in the middle, and the war nations shall be the men and dwell around her. No one shall harm the woman. The woman shall not go to war, but do her best to keep the peace. When the men around her fight one another and the strife waxes hot, the woman will have the power to say, "You men, why do you strike one another? Remember that your wives and children will perish if you do not cease. Will you perish from the face of the earth?" Then the men shall listen to the woman and obey her. With this brief background, let us turn to the great tradition of Our Lady of Guadalupe, the beautiful Epiphany of Mary, a half millennium ago in Mexico, that witnesses to the Sophia wisdom and compassion of God. Our Lady of Guadalupe is the patroness of indigenous peasants displaced by Spanish colonization in Mexico and the U.S. Southwest. Her December 12th feast day is one of the keystone events of Advent. Many Catholic, Latino, and even some Native American groups celebrate the feast day with processions and elaborate fiestas. In East Los Angeles, almost 10,000 people attended the annual parade last year. This tradition is truly an Advent story of the Americas, and we who are non-Catholics have much to learn about this liberating tradition. In the traditional account, Mary appeared in a vision to the dispossessed and demoralized Aztec peasant Juan Diego, on a sacred hill just 10 years after the Spanish conquest of Mexico. She assured him that the God of the Christians actually stood with the poor, not the conquistadores. And Guadalupe has represented a counter-narrative to the long and lamentable story of imperialism in the Americas ever since, particularly in campesino culture. If you want to look at a popular informative book on this historical culture and political tradition, we recommend Virgil Elizondo's Guadalupe, Mother of the New Creation. The image of Guadalupe has inspired many to resist injustice, especially in Chicano movements in the U.S. Southwest. She appears everywhere in Mexican America, often inscribed on people's bodies. Indeed, the great farm worker, advocate, and nonviolent activist Cesar Chavez never marched for justice without some image of La Guadalupana accompanying him. Pictured here is the traditional image that miraculously appeared on the tilma of Juan Diego when he went to testify to the Archbishop of Mexico about his vision. It represents a text rich both in Christian and indigenous symbolism, and it's worth taking a minute to point out characteristics that we may not be familiar with. The aura, or luminous light, surrounding Guadalupe represents divine power. The rays of the sun would have been recognized by the Aztecs as a symbol of their highest god. The lady is standing upon the moon, which for the Mesoamericans was the god of the night. So both archetypes of light and darkness are represented. The eyes of Guadalupe look down with compassion, a contrast to Aztec iconography in which the gods typically stare straight ahead with their eyes wide open. For the Aztecs, only royalty would be carried on the shoulders of someone. So here, an angel supports Guadalupe. Her mantle is blue-green or turquoise, to Aztecs the color of the gods and of the natural forces of life and fecundity. In Christian art, blue is symbolic of eternity and immorality. In Judaism, it is the color of the robe of the highest priest. Some believe that the stars on her mantle represent the constellation that would have appeared before dawn on the morning of December 12th, 1531. Indeed, in the older church calendar, this was the time of the winter solstice. The color of her dress is rose or pale red, perhaps representing the color of dawn, symbolizing the beginning of a new era. The girdle or bow around her waist appears to be a 4-petaled flower, which to Aztecs represents the Nahui Alun, the flower of the sun, a symbol of plenitude. Its cross shape connected with the cross sticks used to produce fire. And the high position of the bow and the slight swelling of the abdomen show that the lady is with child. There's much more to the story than this rich iconography of meaning. And for the women that are joining us at the Advent retreat, we will hear this story. For now, however, we want to focus on 4 key characteristics named above that connect this image with the vision of Revelation 12, of a woman struggling to protect life in the face of a beast who threatens incalculable violence. The image of Guadalupe corresponds closely with John the Revelator's vision in these ways. The woman is clothed with the sun. The moon is under her feet. On her head, a crown of 12 stars, and she is pregnant. Indeed, she is crying out in birth pangs, in the agony of giving birth. this woman takes a fierce stance in front of another portent that appears, a great red dragon.
The dragon is one of the many master symbols used by the apocalyptic writer John of Patmos, who, as you know, was a political prisoner under Rome in the late 1st century of the Common Era. In Revelation, the dragon stands for the lethal violence of empire in all of its forms, and this confrontation between this fierce, heavily armed, omnipotent beast and this unarmed, pregnant woman is one of the great archetypes of the apocalyptic war of myths. In the face of this beast, this mysterious woman courageously gives birth to a son, right in the teeth of the dragon, nurturing life in defiance of death. Like Abigail, she confronts a war machine armed only with the power of love and of life. John's vision of the woman clothed with the sun continues in Revelation 12, and it's kind of interesting. Bit of a strange story, but 3 times in the chapter, John reiterates that the woman takes refuge in the wilderness. The woman flees into the wilderness to the place prepared by God. She is given 2 wings of the great eagle so that she can fly from the beast into the wilderness. And the earth comes to the help of this woman. The Revelator is clearly drawing on the old Exodus motif of Israel's escape from Pharaoh into the wilderness. But whereas in the Exodus story, creation joins in Moses' rebellion, rising up against the empire in the famous series of plagues, here the wilderness receives and protects the woman from the dragon's violence. This nurturing, protective hospitality certainly gives new meaning to the notion of Mother Nature. The wilderness as an incubator and a sanctuary for life is for sure a prophetic strain that runs through the scriptures from beginning to end. Now, the evocative celestial images of Revelation 12 are admittedly, to modern ears, rather strange. In fact, if it weren't identified as a New Testament text, many modern Christians would simply dismiss it as some sort of hallucinogenic or New Age cosmic rant. But John's vision, in fact, is anchored deeply in the biblical narrative and a long genealogy of women who protect life in the face of imperial violence. John of Patmos is alluding to 2 stories in particular. First is found, of course, in Exodus 1 and 2, which narrates the first great story of conscientious resistance in the Bible. It's set in the context of systemic oppression of Hebrews in imperial Egypt. Pharaoh, as with so many rulers across the ages, proposes to manage the problem of the inconvenient poor by simply engineering their demise. But paranoid potentates must always rely on regular people to do their dirty work, and in this case, the recruited accomplices choose life and deceive their superiors to protect the innocent. In the grand biblical narrative, these midwives appear only in this bit part, yet upon their conscientious resistance hangs the whole of salvation history. The actions of holy obedience by the Hebrew midwives of old were at the same time risky acts of civil disobedience. The courage required for such work necessitated that these women be able to see through Pharaoh's policies of genocide, which were publicly promoted beneath the earnest rhetoric of national security or economic development or protecting the homeland. This clarity of vision led the midwives to fashion a sort of underground railroad to save Hebrew innocents, a strategy reproduced some 3,000 years later by courageous African American women such as Sojourner Truth, who smuggled her people to safety in Canada, and Harriet Tubman, who once said, "I freed 1,000 slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more if they but knew they were slaves." According to the Exodus story, one of those who benefited from that first underground railroad in Egypt was none other than Moses, whose mother floated him down the Nile to avoid Pharaoh's pogrom. The Exodus story presents an absurd mismatch, kings versus kids. Yet look at the remarkable conspiracy of women that confounds these odds. Pharaoh's daughter rescues the child and trumps realpolitik with compassion, smuggling him into the very royal house that despises his people. And then, in an almost comic turn, a Hebrew midwife is called for, and thanks to the ingenious covert organizing of the resistance, Moses' mother is also smuggled in to reclaim her child now as a nurse, and gets paid to boot. This is the creative kind of monkey wrenching of the marginalized, who use their hard-earned street smarts to thwart the powerful and to survive. The new leader is even given a revolutionary moniker, Moshe. Out of the water is what that means. Might that be the water that will later in the story drown Pharaoh's army as they try to pursue Moshe and his people in their march to freedom? These are incredible old stories, and they summon us to political imagination in our own time. Similarly, Revelation 12 also draws on the gospel story of Mary of Nazareth, the courageous peasant girl who births Jesus while fleeing as a political refugee. Now in Revelation 12, the intent of the dragon is to devour the child. It's a clear allusion to Matthew's tale of Herod's slaughter of the innocents, which in turn is patterned on the old Exodus story of Pharaoh's war on the Hebrew children that we just saw. Matthew's Christmas story centers around risky acts of conscience again, and the willingness of ordinary individuals to answer and follow God's call, even if it means challenging the beast of empire. So after the Magi from the east defy Herod's attempt to locate the child Jesus, Herod, like Pharaoh of old, launches a paranoid national security policy resulting in a pogrom against the royal house's perceived enemies. The terrible episode that follows, which is truly an archetypal description of the violence that constantly plagues the life of peasant people under the tyrant Herod, again pits kings against kids. This slaughter is commemorated on the Feast of the Holy Innocents on our liturgical calendar. It comes up on December 28th, right between Christmas and New Year's. A conflicted holiday which seeks to remind us that in our world still the powerful stalk the vulnerable, and that our discipleship is supposed to take clear sides on behalf of life. In response or in anticipation of this slaughter, Joseph, guided by dreams and reading the times, takes the risky initiative to go underground with his family, fleeing to Egypt to escape. Jesus thus begins his life as a political refugee. Matthew, of course, understands this episode to allude to the old tradition of Israel in the Exodus wilderness. Out of Egypt I have called my son, as if the circle is being completed. So in sum, both the Exodus tale and the birth narrative of Matthew's Gospel center on a conspiracy led by women to protect life in the face of the imperial beast. Such is the paradox of biblical history. As imperial minds plot genocide, God's messengers enter the world at risk, floating down the Nile in a reed basket, spirited out of the country on back roads. Against the presence of power is pitted the power of presence, Emmanuel, God with us.
So as we celebrate the Feast of Guadalupe this year, let us recall all women who nurture life in defiance of the power of death. From the Levite mother of Moses and the peacemaker Abigail to Mary of Nazareth. And of course, there is a great host of women that we can name tonight.
I'll just give them a heads up.
Yeah. At the end of our time, I'm going to give a list of women that have nurtured us, and also women that you will know that have nurtured you. And we want to invite you to be thinking of the women that have nurtured you, that have stood before the dragon of death and protected life. And so please be thinking of that, and we can raise those women at the end of our webinar. The first woman here is my great-grandmother, Anna Schultz, and she is who we have named our house for, Casa Anna Schultz. And with courage and ingenuity, she protected her children and her family during what we would now call a home invasion. In 1918, during the Civil Russian War, Anna Schultz's house was commandeered by Nestor Makhno and his men. And these were a peasant anarchist army that was particularly brutal. They came to Anna Schultz's house in December of 1918. Makhno's power had greatly increased. His army consisted of about 100,000 men, and he had control of large areas of Ukraine. And this is where the majority of the Russian-Ukrainian Mennonites were living at the end of the 1800s and into the early 1900s. When the family heard the horses, the army coming onto their yard, all the men over age 14 had to flee. And so they fled into the forest. And the girls were hidden upstairs in the attic. My grandmother was 14 years old at the time. About 3 years ago, my oldest sister and I went to Ukraine, and we saw the Schultz Fabrik, or the house that were hidden for 3 weeks. I don't know how they survived, and the work I'm doing right now is a lot about women's stories being silenced. So of course I don't know exactly what happened in that home. But what I do know is that they did survive. Many other Mennonites were murdered and raped during this time. And I know that my great-grandmother Anna Schultz fed, clothed, and nursed these enemy men who had invaded her home and brought them to some level of health. And then they took the remaining resources that my great-grandmother had and left. And then I believe it was the next day that my family packed up what was left and began their journey to Canada. I'm in the middle of doctoral studies. I'm about 1.5 years in, and I'm trying to apply a lens of restorative justice to this story. And I'm focusing particularly on violence endured by women during the Russian Civil War. I'm looking at the at intergenerational transmission of trauma and the silencing of women's stories. I actually have a paper due tomorrow on these two books. So there are two texts that I've been reading. One is Nestor Makhno and the Eichenfeld Massacre, which describes the murder of over 80 people in a small Mennonite village by Nestor and his men. And then the second textbook, which is called Women Without Men, Mennonite Refugees of the Second World War. So this is another story of violence for Mennonites. And it's a wonderful work for me in particular because it is unsilencing the stories of gendered violence during the Second World War, meaning the stories of rape that Mennonite women survived. There's I'm learning the concept of master narratives and communal stories that a community will take on and kind of claim as their own. And in the Mennonite community, as in many other ethnic groups, men's perspectives and men's stories become the accepted narrative, and women's stories are silenced. So this has been an incredibly powerful book for me to read right now because it is bringing to light the stories of silenced women. And of course, I hope to do the same for the stories of the 1920s Mennonite women.
Before you move on, can I interview you a little bit about your research?
Sure. Sure.
As you can imagine, we do a lot of talking about what Elaine is studying, and it's some very painful history and some incredible testimonies of survivors. And one of the things I know that you've been wrestling with is the way in which the story of women survivors tends to get second-class treatment or be suppressed altogether. And so, in part because of the shaming culture, these stories tend to get coded. Do you want to talk a little bit about how some of the ways in which, particularly survivors of rape as an instrument of war, how their stories got coded or even dismissed?
Yeah. What's been interesting, again, and I'm learning this from this Women Without Men, is that these women, and I'm assuming this is applicable to other women that are, again, from a culture or an ethnic group that has a strong sense of identity. And for Mennonites, that would be around acceptable stories of violence and how we responded to violence. So men stories, the males in my family who fled to the forest because they were committed to nonviolence and did not have weapons and would not fight back in the face of violence. Those stories are lifted up and celebrated. Whereas women who, like my great-grandmother, who provided hospitality to these men, many of those women experienced rape. And those stories have not been lifted up or recognized or named. And I wonder if part of it is because of our commitment to nonviolence, that men's only response was to be present and pray for God's protection, or run to the forest and pray for God's protection there. And so the shame of rape, I think, is having a double impact in our community, mainly because of the horror that these women young females to old females were raped, that they experienced, and also because the men were not able to, because of their commitments to pacifism and nonviolence, were not able to respond. So there's lots of ways that women speak about these stories. They'll speak about them in the third person. They'll speak about the consequences of rape, like all of the unborn children, or excuse me, all of the children born to unwed mothers, young girls, older women, women who should not be bearing children. I can't think of other others.
So still today, in the telling of these stories, the women's narratives tend to be marginalized, and there are just a few folks out there who are trying to unearth these stories of incredible fortitude and heroism by women who had lost their men to either violence or flight, and who had to figure out a way to get their children to safety, and who did, often at high cost. And yet when they got to their host countries as refugees, they weren't accepted. This is really something.
And part of what I'm learning as well is that I don't know if it was in World War II, it was the Soviet soldiers that were raping the German women, and the author of this book doesn't quite name that it was systemic military policy, that war or rape is often that in war. But the Soviet army, there is 2 million cases of documented rape by Soviet soldiers against German women during the Second World War. And in Germany, the experience of women is lifted up and is spoken of. The horror of what has happened is spoken of. And the women's ingenuity and courage and the miraculous escapes sometimes of these German women is recognized and celebrated, and their story of trauma is named. In the Mennonite community, as I am understanding, and really as I experienced growing up as a child, it is not spoken about, and that is part of the work that I see before us. And I'm looking particularly at the Mennonite community in Saskatchewan, which has 3 different stories of migration. All 3 of them have different levels of trauma. The second and third migration stories are, of course, the most traumatic. But restorative justice says that we need to wrestle and be courageous to tell the full story of the violence that happened to us, but also how we are complicit in other acts of violence. And there I mean the displacing of Indigenous people, which certainly happened in Saskatchewan. And so I'm wrestling with how to tell a very complex story, particularly focusing on women and bringing their experiences of violence, but also their experiences of courage and their ability to protect their children and their families as they sojourned alone without their men, because so many of them had been disappeared, and they brought their families, children and elderly people to the safety of Canada, and in the case of World War II, to Paraguay as well.
So this is one of the reasons why we also this season wanted to draw close to Guadalupe and the biblical tradition of women standing in the face of the beast, because it really takes on very poignant meaning in actual historical circumstances, not only of the Mennonites in the early 20th century, but of course women and children all around the world today.
and part of what I am wrestling with so much is the silencing of women's stories. And of course, there is a long history of women's stories being hidden in dominant culture or considered as secondary to the heroic feats of men. So, for example, we want to raise a few more women's stories. Women's labor struggles date back to 1857, and here the contemporary life and work of Dolores Huerta, who's the co-founder of the United Farm Workers. Women were, of course, prominent in the civil rights movement, from Rosa Parks to the forgotten movement martyr, Viola Liuzzo. I also want to take a moment to mention 4 of the women that I profiled in our Ambassadors of Reconciliation project book. The first here is Murphy Davis, and I don't know if the open door is on today. Murphy is a dear friend and mentor to Ched and I. She, along with her husband Ed Loring, founded the Open Door community in Atlanta, Georgia. And Murphy has been a tireless advocate for people who are living on the streets of Atlanta and for people who are on death row. She has given her life to the struggle of understanding the death-dealing power that puts people on the street and puts people on death row. We are dearly grateful for the life and witness of Murphy Davis. Marietta Yeager is a woman who has a story of tremendous personal suffering. Her 7-year-old daughter, Susie, was abducted and murdered while they were on a family camping trip in Montana. This happened over 30 years ago. And Marietta has devoted her life to help Christians in particular understand forgiveness and practice the difficult exhortation of a 70 times 7 forgiveness. And she is such a wonderful speaker. And she talks about how, those of us who pray the Lord's Prayer have got to take those words seriously. We were not given those exhortations and then being left helpless in terms of being able to live them out. And so she exhorts and challenges Christians that we need to live up to the words that we pray in the Lord's Prayer and do the difficult work of forgiving our enemies. And she can certainly speak to that. She's been an abolitionist against the death penalty for many, many years and takes her message all over the world. Liz McAllister is another dear mentor and friend. She founded Jonah House in the 1970s, and Jonah House has been on the forefront of the disarmament movement since then. Liz has also done a number of women's retreats with us where she's helped us rescue scripture from the patriarchal interpretations and helped us discover our vocation anew in the biblical stories of women. Jonah House is housed on how many acres in Baltimore?
21 acres.
Yeah, it's a 21 acre, it is a cemetery that was mostly abandoned. And so they are doing this wonderful caretaking of a cemetery, but also homesteading on this 21 acres and growing lots of food. I've been amazed at their pantry cupboards that are full of preserves and ways of preserving the food out of their garden. And Liz also has mentored hundreds of young activists that have come to her in Jonah House and as she's traveled around the United States. Right. Liz is also one of the first Plowshares activists, where activists will go to a military site that houses, Liz in particular went to where B-52 bombers were being housed, and Plowshares activists will pour their own blood and hammer on these instruments of war to render them useless. And her story is also in the Ambassadors of Reconciliation book, and it is a beautiful description of where she felt so deeply called as a disciple to do this work of disarmament so that we can all disarm our hearts.
If you want to learn more about Liz, we did a full webinar interview with her last June, and that's available on our archive site to take a look at. It's a really beautiful interaction with Liz.
Myrna Betke, we got to know after her brother was killed in the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Towers. Myrna described, she was a pastor of a United Methodist Church just outside of New York City, and she described searching for her brother and trying to find out what happened to him, and then needing to step into her pastoral role, and how it was very natural to open their church to all who wanted to come and rage about the violence that had happened, and then the next night to lament and talk about how do we respond as Christian disciples in the face of this horrific violence. And her commitments to peace and justice took her to Afghanistan shortly afterwards, because she knew that the United States would begin to bomb Afghanistan, and she wanted to be with those civilians and stand in solidarity with them as they also had to search through the rubble for their loved ones, because she knew from 9/11 what that experience was about. So she is a part of this amazing group called September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows, who have been subsequently nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. And these activists come together from all over the world and claim that we need to break this spiral of violence and work for peaceful tomorrows and not wage war. Their plea was that the United States not wage war in their names. And lastly, I want to bring to mind Joyce Johnson of the Beloved Community Center in Greensboro, North Carolina. Joyce is also a dear friend and mentor to us. She is one of the animators animators behind the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In 1979, Nazi members and the members of the Greensboro Police Department worked together to shoot up a parade that Joyce and her husband Nelson Johnson were leading. Joyce's little children were there at the time, and as a mother to these children and a mother to so many of us in the movement, she has truly stood in the face of the dragon and bore life there. And we are very grateful to her insistence on healing and on truth-telling and on standing and working for relationships in the community with her enemies. She is an extraordinary example, an extraordinary mentor to us as an ambassador of reconciliation.
And again, if I can just plug the interview that we did with Joyce and Nelson a year ago at the beginning of this year in January, talking about how they have lived their life as peacemakers and justice seekers. That's also available on our archive site. And we are really trying to use this webinar platform to tell stories of people who are exemplary and yet also ordinary in their work. And we want the stories to get out. So be sure and check out those archived webinars as well. Now, we're going to, in just a couple of minutes, we're going to open this up to you to name, and we would like to invite each of our participants to name one woman who's coming to your heart and mind tonight, and to sort of follow Francis Loberg's wonderful example here, and just give us a couple of sentences about that person. Elaine, if you'd read Francis.
Sure.
Right at the moment.
Francis says, I would lift up a woman by the name of Abigail. She is probably a friend of Marietta Yeager. She also lost a daughter to murder and is very active in the ministry of forgiveness and anti-death penalty. Now, friends, as you are typing in, if a number of you are typing at the same time, sometimes your comments are lost, so please don't give up. Keep trying to get those comments in there. And then I encourage you to each try to be brief so that everyone is able to get their comments up there. Thank you.
To read Charlita's.
Oh, Charlita. Marla Ruzicka was an American activist turned aid worker in Afghanistan and Iraq. She believed that combatant governments had a legal and moral responsibility to compensate the families of civilians killed or injured in military conflicts. She's founder of the Center for Civilians in Conflict, first founded as Campaign for Innocent Victims in Conflict. She was killed when she was just 27 years old. And then Solveig from Portland. I lift up Gabrielle Giffords for her work against gun violence, having experienced herself, but working on behalf of others. This is actually from Audrey with Solveig in Portland. And now a number of you are typing, so we will look forward to reading your comments when they come up.
There are so many other women, of course, some of whom we know personally, some of whom we don't, but who have impacted our lives. People such as Nora Bernard of the Millbrook First Nations Reserve in Nova Scotia, who was so instrumental in helping to launch the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation process around Indian residential schools, a process that Elaine has been tracking very, very closely, and which is really magnificent as an exemplary attempt to look at what restorative justice means in the case of historical violations. Sister Dorothy Stang, martyred in Brazil for her defense of the forest and of campesinos in 2005. An incredible story that actually was the jumping off point for our first Eco-Justice Institute here in Oakview in 2010, where we had two members of Dorothy's order, the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur, who joined us, one of whom was Dorothy's roommate down in Brazil. Just an incredible witness of this missionary who naturalized to become, to stand in solidarity with the people, and who ended up being assassinated by ranching and forestry interests in Brazil.
A couple more of you have added. This is from Susie Henderson and Jennifer Henry up in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Eliza is a partner from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Her husband and children were killed in front of her. She was raped and left for dead. Now she is an advocate for other women in the DRC who are seeking healing and legal justice. And Kara Curtis from Philly. Hi, Kara. She names Tiana Gaines Turner, Tiffany Ross, and all the other members of Witness to Hunger, a group of mothers and young children who speak the truth about life on the streets in Philadelphia, particularly about the needs for humane federal food and housing policies. Steve Clemens from Minneapolis, you have already mentioned the three women who have been mentors to me, Liz Murphy and Kathy Kelly. Tim Knopfseeger has lifted up Carol Rose, who has been a mentor to me in her commitment to work at the intersection of undoing racism and peacemaking. Charlita has added Rigoberto Menchu and Julia Esquivel. Now a couple more of you are typing.
As we tell all these stories, we begin to understand why in 2005, 1,000 women from more than 150 countries were jointly nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in an effort to make visible women's work of countering injustice, discrimination, oppression, and violence in the pursuit of peace. So it continues to be an important spiritual and political discipline for us to unsilence these stories, both from scripture, from history, and from our own lives.
Oh, a whole bunch of you have come in. Marcia Dunnigan from Whidbey Island names Barbara Graves, who is 99 years old. We met in Nicaragua when she was a young 68-year-old. She also worked with the 1950s Friends, who won Nobel Peace Prize for feeding orphans and German children. Hope I got that right, Marcia. And then from Lindsay and Tommy Airy down in Orange County, Linda Tamouche started Interfaith Witnesses 2 years ago in response to Muslim hate groups in Orange County, California. As lawmakers did nothing, and some even stoked the flames of the hate, Linda decided to form an interfaith group of nonviolent witnesses who could organize in response to these hate groups and border, protect, and silently stand in solidarity with those being harassed. Now, Frances Loberg in Salem, Oregon. I just returned from 3 weeks in El Salvador and Honduras and want to lift up one of Bethany's good friends, Marina. She works for an organization by the name of Pro Busqueda, which is currently under attack. She is looking to get her children out of El Salvador as we speak, in fear for their safety. This is from Kyle in Indiana. I'm glad you mentioned
I think it's Kyle Vickers.
Excuse me.
From Ontario.
Ontario, Kyle. Sorry, wrong.
Kyle.
I needed a V in there. Kyle Vickers says, I'm glad you mentioned this TRC, Ched. I hold up Lori Ramson, a consultant for the TRC who facilitates church relations, who introduced me to the TRC and has guided me and many others in the church to the work of the commission. Lori Ramson.
Elaine, this gives us a chance to maybe talk for a minute about the TRC in Canada, which in many, many respects has been led by women and continues to be led by women. You have attended 2 of these hearings, and I joined you in Saskatchewan. Talk for a minute about the compassionate presence of the women, I don't know what they were called, aides or ushers, who were there to support people as they told these painful stories of abuse and to sort of be with them. Because it was all women, as I recall.
It was. They were all of these beautiful women, and they were identified, I think, by blue vests. And they were called, I think, support people. And the thing that struck me most about these women is that they would stand behind the person that was giving testimony. And the testimonies are very terrible. They are of horrific abuse that Indigenous children endured in the Indian residential schools all across Canada. These schools were supported by the government, and run by churches. And so the Canadian churches have a very big job to do in terms of coming to terms with the violence that they were a part of, and in figuring out how to step forward. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is an incredible experiment, again, in how a country can heal from a terrible legacy of that. And I do want to make mention of Jennifer Henry, who is on our call, who is the director of Kairos Canada, that is very involved in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And when I was at the commission in Saskatoon, gave an apology on behalf of the United Church of Canada. So thank you, Jennifer, for your work there. These women, the supporters, offer smudging to the witnesses before they go forward and give their testimony. They would stand behind the person who was telling their story of such horrific pain and reliving memories of when they were a small child ripped out of their mother's and father's home. One of the things that struck me as well is that the supporters would also be in the crowd where we were. And if someone was really struggling, they would again come and stand, put a hand on someone's shoulder, sit beside them, and offer a presence of comfort and solidarity, that you are not alone in telling this horrible story or in being witness and hearing this horrible story. And these women would hand out tissues, and at the end of a witness's testimony, they would gather up all of the tissues and they would put them in paper bags. And what was and this was explained to us at the beginning of the TRC, all of the tissues from all the different TRC events, the national events that were happening in each province across the country, these tissues were gathered up and were then added to the sacred fire. And this sacred fire was burning continuously just outside of where the hearings were being held. And the tissues of each gathering were added to this sacred fire, so that the tears from Winnipeg and all the people that were gathered and wept in that place, those ashes journeyed to Halifax. And I may have the order of these, the cities where the TRC held wrong, but I was in Halifax, and so it really struck me that the tears of the first two commissions were also present in Halifax. And then the tears also came all the way to Saskatoon, where Ched and I attended the Truth and Reconciliation there in June of 2012. The sacredness and the care with which the Canadian TRC is being constructed and being held is so powerful, and is truly an example to those of us, the churches in the United States, who also were a part of running Indian residential schools, which we are going to have to face that legacy as a church as well. And the Canadian churches, for the most part, are doing a very good job in addressing that violence. Read. Yeah, go.
Marcia, I think Clancy, up there on Whidbey Island, wants to draw attention to Carolyn Forchet, poet who penned the poetry of Witness Against Forgetting, the poetry of Witness, from the 1915 Armenian massacre through the First Gulf War. Also the poem The Colonel, from the war in El Salvador. She returned to the U.S. after time with Archbishop Romero. If you don't know her poetry, it's highly recommended. Francis, you're not saying too much because your daughter is down there in the midst of all of that, so we know it's on your heart. Talking about Probusqueda was broken into 3 weeks ago. Computers were taken, DNA database taken. Fortunately, there's a copy in Berkeley. Marina's office was burned, and at the same time, Marina was voicing her fears to us about her children. She made such a beautiful and strong statement that they would continue with their work. This is the kind of thing that women are up against in conflict zones. Scott Matherin Jacobson wants to lift up his dear friend and mentor, Kathy Boylan, longtime Catholic worker and Plowshares veteran from Washington, D.C. Kathy is at Dorothy Day House in Washington. She lives a life, an exemplary life. She stresses that it's a life of simplicity. Being present to the poor is as powerful as risking life and years behind bars in an act of nonviolent resistance. She practices hospitality as well as anybody that Scott has ever met, and I certainly echo that, Scott. That's a formidable woman, that Kathy Boylan. A couple of other people have been mentioned here: Aung San Suu Kyi and Megan Rice, also a Plowshares activist. There are simply so many women who teach us about how to stand for life in the face of the beasts of poverty and racism and militarism. So thank you for naming some of these women, and it's our hope tonight that spending a little time together on this webinar, looking at both cultural and biblical traditions, and then voicing this litany of women clothed with the sun, will bring us to focus and mindfulness during this time of Advent. We've been talking a lot about the TRC and Native women in Canada, and just got an email from our friend, known to many of you, Laurel Dykstra in Vancouver, BC. Laurel, of course, was very active in the most recent TRC hearing a couple of months ago in Vancouver. And she just emailed us today to tell us that our friend Cheryl Bear's first book is just been published. Cheryl is most known as a musician who travels all around the world in a music ministry to Native peoples. She and her husband, Randy Barnston, have a goal to visit every tribe in North America. And they're great musicians. And Cheryl has also been very active in TRC stuff. And this book is an introduction to First Nations ministry. Cheryl's a Christian and Native, and really trying to help folk overcome the mutual antipathy between Indigenous traditions and Christianity, and really does powerful work. So you might want to check that out, Introduction to First Nations Ministry.
Say that.
Speaking of which, we do want to let you know that we've got a really great lineup for next year's first half of next year, our monthly webinars. We're going to keep doing this. More and more, we feel called to interview the fabulous circle of people that we're privileged to be part of. So only a few of these have been confirmed, but this is our plan. In January, we will continue our tradition of focusing on the